And when you take those three elements, so mitigating or assessing vulnerabilities based on intelligence, monitoring and making decisions on your third parties based on intelligence, and then proactively testing and adapting defenses based on intelligence, you actually start to move so much further forward into a proactive footing.
Welcome to the Digital Government Podcast. Tune in to discover the future of governance and ways of getting there.
Hello, my name is Merle Maigre. I am the Program Director of Cybersecurity at the Governance Academy, and you are listening to Digital Government Podcast. Cybersecurity is a shared responsibility that requires strong partnership between governments and business. Governments, therefore, face the challenge of adapting to a world where in the cyber domain, the state is no longer the sole provider of intelligence or security. For example, the Deputy Commander of the UK Strategic Command, Lieutenant Colonel Tom Copinger-Sims, said not too long ago in an interview back in September 23 that we are very proud of how much cyber threat data we gather as defense, but that is tiny compared to what Microsoft gathers every day of the week. So his comment underlines the importance of the emergence of private sector as cyber intelligence actor. This podcast today explores how collaboration in cyber threat information sharing can enhance national security. To discuss the private sector's role in this field, we have invited Jack McCurley, a senior intelligence consultant in Recorded Future's intelligence advisory services team based in the UK. Recorded Future is an American cybersecurity company founded back in 2009 by Christopher Ahlberg, a Swedish-American computer scientist and executive. With headquarters in the state of Massachusetts, the company was acquired by MasterCard in 2024. So welcome, Jack.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to this.
Let's kick the conversation open by establishing why should we care about this subject and maybe painting a bit of a threat picture as a context. What does the current attack surface against government infrastructures look like, the way from your perspective?
Well, I think there are a few different aspects to this, but I think a general trend is the consolidation of services into single access points for citizens to use. We've seen that more recently in Ukraine, and I know that the UK is working on this as well. And whilst it makes it particularly more accessible for citizens to use government digital services, it is putting a large amount of data out there in a position where a single point of failure could put it at risk. But it is really encouraging to see governments take a hold of this attack surface and consolidate it in a position to make it, one, more accessible, as I've mentioned, but two, potentially more easy to defend.
Right. So are there any key trends that you would like to outline, key trends in the adversary space that cyber defenders need to be aware of?
Well, I think something that is on the minds of a lot of people, I suppose, is the emergence of AI and the accessibility of tools for potentially lower skilled threat actors. But I would say that something that we experience regularly, and our customers are talking about this, is the emergence over the last couple of years of as a service, ransomware or DDoS or other types of criminal services. And I think that makes it more difficult for companies to track specific actors that may target them. But it does highlight the importance of understanding the tools and techniques that are being used and the behaviors that are being used in these sort of attacks, and focusing on that methodology of tracking threats. So exploring behaviors and tools rather than the specific actors that may target them. So I think that's one thing that definitely has emerged over the last couple of years, alongside, potentially alongside AI as well. Something that we do often talk about as well is this kind of pivot towards logging on. So malicious actors logging on using legitimate services that have been exposed through credential leaks or info stealers as well. And I think that is quite an important one to kind of acknowledge, is that, and that initial access being achieved through legitimate means is particularly difficult to defend. But you do have an opportunity with intelligence to try and mitigate against this. So that kind of initial info stealer infection, even prior to a sale of those credentials, is actually a really good opportunity for the blue team through intelligence to identify that attack before it's even happened. So whilst that is an increasing trend for attackers, it does give an opportunity for us as defenders as well.
Fascinating. So you mentioned cyber attack as a service, ransomware as a service. Does that assume that the criminal organized crime in cybersecurity is also getting more institutionalized? Cyber crime groups are getting more sophisticated, so to say, in outsourcing some of their attacks. Is that what you're seeing? And how much has that scene been influenced by the war in Ukraine? Can you share a bit of your experience from involvement in Ukraine, of how that war there informs the rest of the cyber attacks elsewhere, if it does? Thanks.
Sure. Okay. Well, I think there's kind of a couple of different pieces to unpack there. I think the first about cyber criminals themselves. I think the affiliate programs that are being run by cyber criminals, I think, have matured. If not, I'm not sure if there's a better word for that. But we see that. I mean, we've seen that even more recently in the UK in the last few weeks with affiliate programs of ransomware actors targeting the retail space, very prominently Marks and Spencer's in the last month or so. So those affiliate programs are becoming more professional, more common, and I think we'll continue to see that. On the other side, though, I think Ukraine provided maybe an opportunity, I suppose, but definitely a kind of a single target for a lot of actors to be drawn towards that may not otherwise do so. And I think those affiliate programs do give them the opportunity to access tools and techniques that they wouldn't otherwise do. The more general trends that we engage with from Ukraine, I suppose in 2024 and 2025, is through state-sponsored activity. I'm not sure if that's just a bias of where I'm looking at, perhaps. But yeah, the state-sponsored activity, both in the cyberspace, but particularly more in the information space, has been kind of the most prevalent over the last 12 months, I would say, directly in Ukraine, but also indirectly in their supply chain, I suppose, through NATO. And you see that now very prominently in Poland in particular, as they approach their election.
Interesting. Thanks very much for that. So in trying to move on and really to the core of something that's intriguing me, is the use of open source or commercial intelligence in cyberspace. So perhaps to establish a little bit the terms and defining the terms. So what exactly are we talking about? According to Gartner, threat intelligence is what it is evidence-based knowledge that provides context, mechanisms, indicators, and action-oriented advice on both existing and emerging threats. So this knowledge includes everything from understanding attack mechanisms to predicting future threats, allowing organizations to strengthen their defense, so to say. So cyber threat intelligence, as part of it, refers to the collection, processing, and analysis of data to understand the threat actors' motives, targets, and attack methods. I think that's pretty. Would you agree in that definition?
Yeah, I think that's pretty comprehensive.
Okay. So in an attempt to kind of like me playing a devil's advocate of like why do we need commercial cyber threat intelligence? Let me ask. Do you think commercial CTI or cyber threat intelligence is a sustainable model, or is it destined to failure in the face of free and open source intelligence, or the OSINT, as there is a vast pool of free data out there? So why should governments work with Recorded Future and other companies like you to actually pay for the subscription in threat intelligence platforms that you offer?
So I think there's a difference here between like truly open source intelligence and commercial intelligence or commercially provided intelligence. And whilst we are a open source intelligence company, Recorded Future are an open source intelligence company on the face of it. We collect and distribute far more than what you would traditionally think of as open source. So whilst we operate at an unclassified level with most governments in our intelligence sharing, the data that we're collecting isn't just from those traditional open source places. It has an aspect of human intelligence through interaction with threat actors. It has an element of what traditionally we would refer to as signals intelligence through identification and collection of network traffic between malware C2s, for example. And from closed sources, so sources that we wouldn't traditionally think of as open source, such as closed higher tier forums or marketplaces where we collect info stealer data from, perhaps. So some of these specialist sources and specialist collections aren't necessarily available through all open sources. And what I would say for Recorded Future's perspective is the ability to collect, analyze, pull that together in real time, I think is actually the really unique piece here. And exploring that data in real time, kind of at your fingertips, is a really, really powerful tool. And whilst it would be fantastic if this was freely available to everybody, the reality is that the work behind it and the technology required to achieve that requires investment. And that's what kind of pushes the intelligence cycle around from Recorded Future.
Understood. Fair enough. And convincing. Thank you. So having established the usefulness of interacting with the private sector, can you walk me through or explain in some of the trends and particularities about communicating actionable intelligence and information and sharing the cyber threat intelligence with governments? Do you have some criteria of which governments to work with, how to do that, how does that go forward in the pretty politically loaded environment, not only state-sponsored state actors coming up from China, Russia, or Iran, as we read from several annual intelligence assessments, but also a more politically loaded transatlantic relations. So any changes in trends in how you interact with governments?
Sure. Okay. Well, I think there's a couple of different ways that we interact with governments. And the first one we are a business, and that first one through commercial relationships with companies are generally defined by law as a baseline. And then as a company, I know that we look to understand or make an assessment of how that data is going to be used ethically as well. That commercial relationship is through the interaction of our data or with our data. But collaboration with government, I think, is slightly different. And our CEO, you introduced him earlier, Christopher, was very comfortable talking about this in 2022, about the support that we provide for Ukraine. And this wasn't a commercial relationship, and it isn't a commercial relationship. It is a collaborative relationship with Ukraine. And I think that is different. And the assessment at the time was that it was the right thing to do. And this is a very prominent relationship. It's publicly talked about. But we do have similar relationships privately with other governments. And again, that's based on an assessment that the company makes along, I suppose, it's an ethical decision. And whilst I don't have insight into the exact decision making that goes on, I'm sure it looks at how that data will be used, what the intentions are of the government, and what their overall mission is. And I think if we look at how that works with Ukraine as an example, it generally works at a kind of peer-to-peer collaborative level with or between analysts. And I haven't spoken about it yet, but Recorded Future has a dedicated research team that we call Insikt Group, Swedish for insight. And their peer group within the Ukrainian intelligence services and national certs, for example, are able to work directly with them through the relationship that the company set up with Ukraine. And I think that type of collaboration to support a very specific goal is really powerful. And I think if you look at the content that CERT Ukraine push out, you can see in it very clearly that they have support and collaboration, not just with Recorded Future, but with many other supporters and organizations across the cyber threat intelligence space. And I think that has made a real difference to not just the ability to detect threats, but the ability to share threats. And I think that's actually a really important lesson that we will take from Ukraine moving forward. Hopefully not in another conflict, but at least in another competitive cyberspace over the next few years. And then that ability to share intelligence really quickly across the open source community from Ukraine has been really, really powerful and really useful in mitigating a lot of the threats coming from particularly Russian state-sponsored actors over the last 2 years or more.
Very impressive, very good. Am I right in assuming that at the working level, your prime counterparts on the other side, using the intelligence, cyber threat intelligence information that you produce, are analysts most often members of the computer emergency response teams or SOC teams, right?
In the case of Ukraine, I think those are the ones that we publicly talk about, or they publicly talk about. But we do support far more than that, not just across direct government departments, but also critical national infrastructure as well.
All right. So my question in that sense is to you as you see it from the private sector. What does it take or what is needed to position these SOC teams, CERT teams in countries, governments, and critical infrastructure companies that sometimes are only learning to get stronger and establish themselves? What is needed to position them as strong partners for you in the private sector? Do you have a view on that?
Well, I think the first step for implementing kind of intelligence into a SOC or into a program is by getting data into the hands of the analyst. And I think the first step has to be taking threat feeds, enriching data, and giving context to the analysts so they're able to see not just what is going on inside their world, but seeing what else is going on outside of their world. And I think that's the first step. So having an openness and having the technology there to be able to take on data, not just from us, but from everywhere that they can go and get it, is probably the first step. And if you're able to put your analysts in a position where they don't need to be manually taking data, manually investigating it, manually validating it, but allowing your computers to do that for you and putting time back into the analysts to allow them to go and analyze, I think is the fundamental part of kind of taking on cyber intelligence for the first time. And I think generally governments are in a good place to do that. I very rarely see intelligence taken on without the forethought and the purchasing of the technology to use it. Sometimes we see that in the private sector space, potentially a little bit more. But yeah, from my experience in the public sector, it's, I suppose, the understanding of that they're investing in a capability rather than just a tool, I think is more prevalent. So not just investing in a tool, but investing in the technology behind it, the people that are needed, and also supporting the development of policy or procedures to enable that intelligence to be used as well.
Thank you. That's useful, and that's very, very, I think, useful to know. So now, reflecting back, we've discussed a little bit the in a threat environment context. We've established why the usefulness of commercial threat intelligence. We've discussed what it is, what does it take to communicate actionable intelligence, and the usefulness of giving time back to the analysts. I would like to continue the conversation from the phase of how to get threat intel to perhaps also discuss a little bit how can cyber defenders, how can blue team members be more cautious and get stronger in building up their defenses with the information. So can you perhaps delve a little bit into what are some of the other key processes that have to be considered in threat management for the blue teamers at national or commercial critical information infrastructure networks to get stronger?
Well, I suppose one of the pieces that I advise on is taking kind of 3 steps to kicking off a threat intelligence program. So if we look at the first, threat-based vulnerability management, so using intelligence to make an assessment of the specific threat associated with a vulnerability and enabling an informed decision to be taken on whether to patch, mitigate elsewhere, or just tolerate the risk associated with that vulnerability. There are lots of different frameworks for making vulnerability assessments out there. CISA in fact, it was a few years ago, really, CISA published a really useful algorithm for making that assessment based on intelligence. And that's probably a really simple place to start. So using intelligence to define the threat associated with a vulnerability. And it can just be as simple from an intelligence perspective of checking or validating the proof of concept associated with a vulnerability. Is it automatable? Does it require hands on keyboard? And that kind of intelligence can be picked up really quite simply with a commercial intelligence tool. The second part is monitoring and mitigating supply chain risk. So it can be quite difficult to understand the specific threat from a third party. And often we rely on surveys or assessments that are made by these third parties during procurement, perhaps. But something you can start to do with intelligence is to make an assessment of the risk associated with that third party yourselves. And we provide this data for thousands of our customers, and it enables them to identify perhaps misconfigurations on their public portals. Perhaps if they have a large amount of credentials for sale, or maybe there's just chatter in kind of a spike in chatter on forums or the dark web. And it allows an intelligence team to make an assessment, an evidence-based assessment of the risk associated with a third party, identify potential attack vectors, and then either take steps internally to reduce the amount of exposure they have to those companies, or to work with them, which I think is probably the most powerful method to mitigate some of that risk. So if they've identified that perhaps there is a spike in credentials being stolen that would suggest an info stealer infection, passing on and sharing that data with a third party is really powerful. And then the final one, I suppose, of directly integrating with a blue team or supporting a blue team with intelligence is through what's sometimes called purple teaming. So combining both the roles of the blue team with the red team and supporting them with intelligence. And something that you can use intelligence to do, and when I speak to customers, we start we're not too ambitious with this, but it's through the production of attack packs. So a intelligence analyst looking at what a threat actor is using, which tools they're using, how they are using them, and the context that they're using them, to build out an attack pack to pass on to the red team. And this attack pack could be using some of the data perhaps that our Insect group have put together, which may or may not also include a detection rule as well. And they can pass on these, and normally we aim, or I would suggest aiming for perhaps 3 or 4 over the course of the year, to allow the red team to simulate an attack that is directly related to what we see in the wild. And it can allow the blue team to validate their controls against real life adversary activity before it hits them. And it just allows a blue team to move more into a proactive security footing. And when you take those 3 elements, so mitigating or assessing vulnerabilities based on intelligence, monitoring and making decisions on your third parties based on intelligence, and then proactively testing and adapting defenses based on intelligence, you actually start to move so much further forward into a proactive footing and actually putting the advantage in the hands of the blue team. So those 3 steps, I think, although I've talked about it for a little bit longer than perhaps I was expecting, those 3 steps are really important tools that the blue team can use from intelligence.
No worries. This is really fascinating, and I think also very useful in not just explaining the ways of business of the pure threat intel, but also how to absorb it, how to use it, how to make use of it more proactively, so to more comprehensively build up the defense. This is really, really useful. Thank you for that. Maybe to come close to wrapping things up, as a last question, I'd like to ask you about the AI. When describing the threat environment, you mentioned AI helping to get the adversaries, the malicious actors, more crafted. But to what extent do you see AI also being an opportunity for the blue teams, for the defenders, in building up the stronger defense?
So I think the key takeaway, and we see this being implemented right now, is the ability to collect, analyze, and distribute large amounts of data in real time using AI. And I think what it allows blue teams to do is to put more, apply humans to their strengths. So understanding, disseminating intelligence, and allows AI to be used for what its strengths are, which is processing large amounts of data at speed. As an example, something that we've just started to roll out, and I know has been incredibly useful over the last few weeks already, is using AI to identify patterns in malware. So taking a huge repository of malware from the wild, analyzing it for patterns, and then taking those patterns to produce Yara rules to enable detections, or perhaps to pivot in a incident response. Applying AI where it's strong, I think is actually a really powerful tool for a blue team.
Excellent. Jack McCurley, thank you very much for joining me in this conversation, and keep up listening to us at the Digital Government Podcast.
This podcast is brought to you by the eGovernance Academy. Tune in next time.